So thank you all for coming, and it's quite an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you. It's such an amazing group of people. We know because we visited, I think, all your programs. The other people here, I won't mention names, but who are luminaries not only in India but globally. And so thank you all for coming here. It's a very special event for all of us. And I want to make sure I thank you all, each one of you, for the time you've spent hosting us at your own organizations in the field. We've learned a lot. Now you must be all wondering one thing which you have very politely not asked. What is this day really about? What is this Alexander Associates thing? What's the connection, if any, with, Avahan and so on? Sorry, what did you say, Prashant? That is, at least Alexander is, that's a clue, yes. And there's A's everywhere here. Before we start, I just wanted to, all of you, I think it'll be too long to go around doing introductions. I would really say it's over the course of the day. I hope you'll meet as many people as you can, because I guarantee you can learn a lot. We can learn a lot from each other. But I'm just mentioning my team here because they're useful people in case you want any help or guidance from where to go and so on and so forth. So we have Anjora, we have Nishta, we have Asta, they're at the back there, there's Harsh, and there's Anjali Alexander, who's also connected, who's a director on Alexander Associates. So let me start now by saying who are we, what are we, why are we here today, what's in it for you to come all the way here, spend all this time with diverted flights and so on, and what feedback can you give us at the end of the day? Okay, so let me start by just saying a little bit about myself. I think I've in some ways had a fairly unusual career. I spent half that career in the business sector. I worked in an organization called McKinsey & Company, which likes to say it's the world's preeminent management consulting firm. So I spent half my career helping rich companies become richer. So this was a fairly meaningless pastime, but I learned something from it. I spent half my career doing that. 2003, I jumped into public health, working on HIV, AIDS. My good friend Jana is here, one of my first mentors in this work. So many of us worked together and created a program called Avahan. Avahan grew to become probably still the largest HIV prevention program, privately managed anywhere in the world. And that work is not credit to me or my team. It's not even credit to Jana, but to credit to 150 NGOs, 8 to 10,000 frontline workers, all commercial sex workers, male, female, transgender, who together created a program of that scale, which was later credited with averting a lot of infections, and definitely along with other people. We were just one group of people, along with scores of others, having made a contribution to stemming HIV in India. Having done that, I moved in 2014, really started work with this organization I set up called the Antara Foundation. And that work continues. It's a switch to maternal and child health, working in Rajasthan mainly. Now we'll be starting work in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And then we have today Alexander Associates. These are separate organizations, by the way. There is no real connectivity except me between Antara Foundation and Alexander Associates. So think of it this way. So in this journey, which is, about 35 years of my working life, 50% in business, you can think of it this way, 50% in public health. So the one thread, there are two threads that go through this career that I've had the chance to live. One is the notion of scale, scaling up of interventions. Interventions that are brilliant, often not scaled up, sometimes scaled up dramatically. What is the art and science of that? And the second, which is the topic today, is knowledge. What is the thread of knowledge that can be carried from intervention to intervention, sometimes across sectors, sometimes against organizations, which look very disparate on the face of it, right? what is a thread? And that thread is knowledge. And I think that the premise or the belief that with which we put Alexander Associates to say is that this knowledge is a precious commodity that often evaporates. Is there a way to share that knowledge? Right? So let me explain this in a little more detail if I can find my clicker. Nishta? Yeah. Okay. So this is a nice business card way of sharing it. I'll explain this as we go along. What I had the chance to work on with Avahan and Yantra Foundation was the idea of scale. And now Alexander Associates, the linked idea of sharing of knowledge. In Antra, as I said, we had a chance to work on a large scale across India, 6 states, and a very, very huge population of sex workers, people most vulnerable to HIV, transgenders, truckers, and so on. I mentioned that. Now, Avahan ran for me from 2003 to 2012. That was the main period of Avahan. Somewhere during that process of working on Avahan, an idea came into my mind that these methods that we're using to scale up HIV prevention actually are very simple methods. What are we really doing? We are managing supply, we are managing demand, we are doing advocacy work. There are only these 3 elements. If you think a little more about these are the very things that businesses also do. They are just a carryover of what I learned in business. It's really, for me, it was an extension. NGOs would have come to that conclusion from their own roots, but for me it came from business. Now, if you look at those 3 elements, what is the crux of it? On the supply side, we were really looking at how data is used by frontline workers, whether it is a business that's being run there, a pharmaceutical sales force, or whether you're working with sex workers delivering HIV prevention services. The crux of it is data use. The crux of scaling up supply is not necessarily just strengthening facilities. Where the rubber hits the road is the data used by those frontline workers. So if a sex worker was dealing, a peer worker was dealing with, say, 50 or 100 sex workers, all sex workers are not the same. How many sex workers, of what kind, how many condoms did they use, how many condoms did their clients use, and therefore what are the 5 or 6 most risky, most individuals most vulnerable to HIV? That was the crux of it. That data was not easily accessible. How do you grasp that data? Because if you get that data, you can focus your program delivery on much fewer cases. You're more efficient and you're more effective. This is a business principle. On the demand side, communities. You know, Jana was a pioneer of this work anywhere. But there are others in this room who have also done work with communities in their own ways. We saw in Avahan, having learned from efforts around, we have programs everywhere who were working with communities, not just as part of the service delivery, but also in the whole area of vulnerability reduction. We came to understand that a woman's vulnerability, especially a woman's vulnerability in any of these sectors, is the reason why she can't take up a product. It's not so much because the product isn't good enough. After all, what is so novel about a condom? What is so novel about breastfeeding? These are the products that exist. The barriers that come in the way of uptake are a function of the vulnerability of that consumer, if I may call it that. How do you mobilize that consumer group? Rather, the better question is, how do you act as an enabler to harness the power, to release the power that is inherent in communities? So in Avahan, communities played a very large role. Here we are departing a little bit from businesses. Businesses make a big deal out of saying close to the consumer, but rarely, it's only in public health, done at its best, that communities actually take over and run the program. And so many of you are doing that so well. And the third is advocacy, because you can do all of these things. The reasons we thought and we saw that interventions don't scale up is not because the products don't exist. Public health sometimes spends a lot of time reinventing products and refining things that already exist. The real barriers are barriers of gender, barriers of inequity, barriers of logistics, barriers of poverty that get in the way. A woman wearing a ghungat in remote area of Rajasthan is a woman without a voice. She faces 10 barriers to be able to do exclusive breastfeeding. How do you deal with that? So a combination of these things, it started hitting us that we are doing actually very obvious things. These are not things which will people say, wow, you're working on demand. That's incredible, you're working on supply. If it is so obvious, the thought occurred to us that can we create an organization that brings this know-how of scaling up to specifically maternal and child health? And why maternal and child health? So many people in this room work in that area because we know it is the area of one of the biggest areas of mortality and morbidity in health in India. I mean, we all know that about something like 1 million children under 5 die unnecessarily, many of them within the first 48 hours of their birth. This is completely unnecessary. Is there an organization that can apply these principles, deliver methods which draw from this thread to scale up health? I'm very happy to say this, that Antara to me at a personal level was a testing of a proposition. For the lessons in scaling up, drawn from Avahan, drawn from other programs like polio and so many others which you all are running, can they be put into another organization? So Antara's innovations today, several of them are being scaled up in 46,000 villages in Rajasthan, in every district in Rajasthan. AAA mapping, somebody was telling me how it's being used in Assam right now, which I didn't even know. And several states, 5 states have approached us, we'll be starting work in other areas. So the reason I'm saying this is not to be boastful in any sense, but to look at it clinically as a practitioner and say, knowledge, the knowledge from business, in my life, from business to Avahan to Antara, was knowledge that carried through. So the idea of creating a transfer of knowledge into another organization to me has proven true. But let me step back from this and say, is knowledge sharing, okay, I had the chance of doing it in my career. Many of you have done it in your careers. But how well does the sector as a whole do this knowledge sharing? So let me give a couple of perspectives on this so we can really see the impact of this. My short answer before jumping ahead is to say not very well. But let me come to that in a minute. When I worked in the private sector, if a company X worked on developing a new product or a new type of soap or a new type of anything that companies tend to work on, and company Z did this, similar was developing the same product, what would they do with the knowledge that they'd shared? They'd hide it. They'd go to great lengths to hide it. Sometimes even within their organizations, people wouldn't be told, because knowledge was a source of competitive advantage. Knowledge shared is a loss of competitive advantage. Knowledge that is kept away and brought to the market first, you are the first mover and you get profits. There is nothing wrong with this behavior. In fact, this is excellent behavior in the private sector. You are serving your shareholders well by doing that. You don't get together and say, we're all making soaps. Hindustan Lever is making soap and Procter & Gamble is making soap. Let's put all our knowledge and make one type of soap. That doesn't work at all. Take another area. I recently met someone, very interesting person, who's climbed a lot of mountains. I asked him, Everest was climbed in 1954. When did Everest expedition start? He said in the late 19th century. So I said, so many expeditions failed before Hillary and Tenzing planted a flag. How did they get there? They were using the knowledge that had come from expeditions from 1875. Every expedition that failed, when they got back home, they made it a point to systematically collate all that they had learned, all the mistakes they had made. They said, don't go down this track, don't go down this trail, take this route, I wish we'd done it. They put it there so the next expedition could do that. Why did they do this? Why did they not act as though they're also making soap? If I didn't climb Everest now, I'll climb it 10 years later. Because they saw this as a public service. Everest is a mountain mankind must conquer. So they shared their knowledge systematically, and it was a culture and it was an obligation on their part. I worked a whole career in McKinsey and Company, very close to business. McKinsey stands out for many things, or likes to think it stands out for problem solving and many other things. But the thing that they really, really stand out is something public doesn't know. It's knowledge sharing. So when I joined McKinsey in New York, I was put on an assignment in the steel industry. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, I knew nothing about steel. I understood that the next morning I would know enough, probably to impress the client I was talking to, who had worked in that industry for 30 years. How is that possible? In a day long before digital transfer of information, I could lay my hands, I could pose a question, and I could lay my hands on the information on that topic that came from Germany, which came from parts of Asia, from Thailand, other places where McKinsey consultants had worked on the same issue. That knowledge was shareable. In those days, it took an overnight transfer, faxes, and so on. In the morning, I was smart enough to ask the next question. The next question led to more knowledge. So people didn't get promoted. They were brilliant people who actually developed clients, solved problems, kept the knowledge to themselves. Often their careers were short-lived. Their careers were terminated because they said, this person doesn't share knowledge. This formed a deep impression on me. So when I moved from this sector, one where knowledge is not shared, then to an organization that shared it, McKinsey, it left a deep impression on me, and I moved into the social sector with Avahan, with HIV prevention. I said, this is wonderful. People are working in public health. They are working to save lives. They must be sharing all the knowledge that they have. So saying, we have the same mission together. And I was shocked to find that there were centers of excellence. One of the first places I went to was Sonagachi. I went to few other places, and I emphasize the word few, because I was discovering that people are doing excellent work in different parts of India, different methods of mapping populations, different methods of data use, different ways of working with community. I went to Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, other places where they also did these things well. But HIV prevention had never been scaled up. In the history of HIV prevention, at anywhere near the scale of a country like India, actually only relatively small countries like Thailand had done it. A key reason was the lack of sharing knowledge. And this was something that we set out to do. Avahan became one of the most documented public health programs, more than 300 peer-reviewed publications and more. Because we introduced a goal that was not there in the beginning. We said knowledge sharing or lack of is the biggest gap in this sector in HIV prevention. And therefore we set out a goal and said we have to put out our knowledge and develop a method for disseminating knowledge so that it's a public good. Now when I move to maternal and child health, I find the same thing. All across India, interventions doing very good work, but not sharing that knowledge with each other. I'm putting this a little dramatically. Some of you may be thinking, no, that's nonsense. We share our knowledge freely. And yes, that's the reason you're in this room. Many of you do collate your knowledge. Most of you share that knowledge, peer-reviewed publications to, conferences or newspaper articles or benchmarking trips. People come to your facilities. Prashanto's here. I mean, he's one of many experts in this room who are a role model for capturing knowledge and putting it out where the entire world now comes to visit Ekjut. But by and large, if you look at the sector as a whole, and now let's just picking maternal and child health, broadly defined, it doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? And here I'm coming to the reason for Alexander Associates. The reason it doesn't happen, in my view, are threefold. One is people who run interventions, spend a lifetime running programs of a certain kind, don't realize that they are sitting on a gold mine of knowledge. They simply don't recognize knowledge as a huge asset that they have a chance to capture and to perhaps an obligation to transmit. Therefore, when you are not aware, there's a second group that is aware but doesn't have the organizational skills to know how do you collate knowledge, capturing knowledge is itself a skill. It's not that you say, let's capture knowledge. You have to know how to capture that knowledge, document it, different methods of doing it, using data effectively. That skill is not there organizationally. Third, if you have that data, sometimes the worst happens, it's not transmitted. And sometimes the very worst that happens, but unfortunately happens, is for competitive advantage. As though we're in the private sector. To say we have this knowledge, there's an RFP coming out on such and such from the Gates Foundation or whatever, let's form a consortium. Consortiums by and large are meaningless. That's not true knowledge sharing. It's something you put into an RFP. Perhaps they won't last into a it's not a systematic thing that is done. So enough said about all of this. What I'm trying to say in summary, unless I've, and perhaps I've repeated it several times, that knowledge is the precious asset that will evaporate unless it's captured quickly in a systematic way, transferred as an obligation in public health. So Alexander Associates is this point in time just a gleam in the eye. The idea is, these are the organizations we visited. I should have put this up. There's a tremendous group of people here that you shall get to know during the course of the day. But if I try to put there's no smart vision statement here. These are thoughts that have come to my mind at this stage, somewhat nebulous. What's a vision for this knowledge? It's a knowledge network. It's a national network of organizations that continuously shares knowledge about health delivery, methods, tools, data, especially mistakes, new opportunities that they've seen, new ways of climbing Everest, and more. So these are organizations that participate in what I'll call as a virtuous network. So this is part of our work, this dissemination. I envisage it as a subscription service. I don't believe anything should be free. You can't go into a library and borrow a book. It's not of that kind. The value of it comes because you subscribe to this service. You're part of this network. It's open primarily to ground level implementers. This is not, how would I say, an academic network. This is for people like you who work at the ground, have dirt under your fingernails, and that's what you do most of the year. So this is knowledge sharing of that kind, but also to government, to donors, to academia. It will today, in today's world, digital methods are available to us. Rapid sharing, rapid transfer of knowledge, but as far as possible, face-to-face connections. And I don't mean connections like we're having today in this fancy hotel and nice room, conference room. I mean out in the field. When we had the privilege of visiting your organizations, we came back with 100 ideas every time. So that is the kind of methodology we envisage. And people conjoined by a sense of mission and larger purpose. Let's call this network Alpha. We are part of the Alpha network. We share knowledge. And that knowledge sharing also has some self-interest in it. Because we are not all here to do kind of holy work and keep sharing knowledge. We have a self-interest too. I will be better at serving my community if I've shared knowledge from 5 organizations that exist. I will win that RFP, if I might put it bluntly, because I can say there are 8 organizations behind this thought. So there is a self-service knowledge, and from a business sense, you can answer this question that it's self-sustaining and ever-expanding. To create a network, you need 3 people. That's a minimum network. 3 could become 20, 30, 50 organizations, actually very rapidly. It can happen in 2-3 years' time, because there's a self-interest involved. So it's ever expanding in the notion of a subscription service, a small subscription every year, and then people have an incentive to come and join that network. This is the idea. Now, there might be a virtual secretariat that advises, supports, and connects. What does all this have to do with the fact that our team showed up at your doorstep, took your valuable time, asked a lot of perhaps oversimple questions, and came away with knowledge? What is in it for you except that we took away your time? Is there something that can come out of this which is useful to you? So let me put in context the work that we are doing now and this sort of vision. The work that we're doing now is the project that we are involved with today. Started in November 2017 when we formed this organization, and it is a contract from the Gates Foundation to Alexander Associates. It is a contract to look at 50 key interventions around India. And we've gone through some criteria of finding these. We're always open to being told where else we should go. The idea is that these interventions all have something to teach all of us. We have completed 28 so far. Those 28 are in the room today, right? So at the end of it, what will compound of that? There will be a compendium of learnings. There will be an event like this in between, perhaps one more event. But in the end, we'll try to systematically say to give each of you a digital manual of intervention, so that if you are, for example, working with creches, you know that there are 12 other organizations doing that, so you can start that rudimentary beginnings of a network. The knowledge sharing network is not part of this. I'm being very, the financial flow of it. Nobody's funding us to do that. Hopefully someone will. But this today is a ... starting of that discussion. This is the first time actually I've talked about it anywhere. I hope by the end of the day, people we'll poll you. We'll say, does this concept make sense? And to what extent do you need to use knowledge at all in your work? Now, let's have a look now. How am I doing for time? Okay. Anyway, I'm wrapping up. So some of the themes, several themes emerge from our travels through India, visiting 28 interventions. It's too early to say what are the 8 themes that matter. Probably you'll never get there, right? But right now, what are the themes that we saw emerging? And this is our way of saying, is there early evidence that this notion of common purpose exists? Infrastructure provisioning or strengthening is something by which I mean there are areas, particularly, for example, tribal areas, where the government infrastructure is just so weak or non-existent that programs have to make efforts to say, how do we strengthen this infrastructure? We visited these crosses, mark out organizations that we've seen, which do this and other stuff. So it's suffice to say there are about 14, 15 organizations who stand out for this. Probably all organizations do this, but some who just in our mind come out, stand out for this. Creches for early childhood care and development. Mobile creches is a name many people will know as a model for that, based here in Delhi. But there were several that we visited. We were surprised to see we found 8 organizations who were working at rural creches in different ways. Each one of them was doing something novel. Each one of them had a little different angle on the same issue of early childhood care and development. Do all 8 talk to each other? Are they even aware of each other? How many more are there? This map might have 30, 40, 50 organizations in India doing that. Do they share their knowledge about running creches? Some of you do. There are networks between this, as we'll find during the course of the day. But is it systematically being done? Frontline data, beneficiary identification and prioritization is something we've seen some best practices in different visits. How do you pinpoint, as we pinpointed the sex worker or pinpointed the high-risk pregnancy, how do you actually get to that? Is frontline data, organizations doing that well? Community groups, awareness creation, service uptake, vulnerability reduction. There are organizations doing that as well. Creative communications, advocacy and building salience, organizations doing that. In other words, these travels so far to 28 organizations has got my pulse rate up a little bit to say, yes, there are organizations. I had never even heard of these organizations. Partly my ignorance, but also many people may not have heard of these organizations who work in that sector for their lifetimes, right? This is proven in this, even at this early stage, that the basic concept works. There is knowledge, there's knowledge to be shared. So if you put this all together, it's already quite a crowded map of a lot of people who could be part of a network eventually. There could be more themes, there could be more people. So This is the knowledge exchange. You don't have to pay too much attention to it, but I can't resist the temptation in the end. Perhaps it's my McKinsey orientation, or perhaps it's a wish to put something in a framework, that there could be a hub where concepts and frameworks, programming implementation methods, organizational know-how, monitoring data evaluation methods, all of the things that come from a program are transmitted to people who can use that, donors, communities, government, and so on. And this becomes the knowledge network. It becomes the ecosystem captured through systematic methods, transmitted and disseminated also systematically to audiences and participants. I'm sure we'll find a simpler way of depicting this, but I tried to put it all on one slide, that this is the ecosystem. So today's meeting, either I've clarified or I've confused. I don't know which part, where the needle is. I like to think that I've tried to clarify. Many of you will say this is extremely confusing presentation. So to simplify it, all I'll say is this: we're all doing excellent work. You all in this room are people I feel privileged to have got to know even a little bit. And my team feels very honored to have visited your organizations. But even in this group, if I might say this, I wonder if there's enough sharing of your cross-knowledge. In India, it doesn't exist. The network we are talking about is a way of seeing whether we can create that, whether 5 years from now we can have a wonderful national knowledge-sharing network, and whether this concept can be made to grow. Enough then for my introduction. Today we'll have 3 panels which will examine 3 themes that came out from this, and I'll hand it off to Priya. Priya is an invitee from the Antara Foundation, and her role we invited here is actually to moderate the first panel.